She's among multiple candidates taking aim at Turing Pharmaceuticals, which recently acquired Daraprim for treatment of a parasitic infection. It's now increasing the price of a pill from $13.50 to $750. Some major streets are being closed in and around the nation's capital as President Obama prepares to greet Pope Francis this afternoon upon arrival at Andrews Air Force Base. The pontiff is arriving from Cuba, whose president, Raul Castro, gave him a formal send-off. Reporting from Havana, NPR's Carrie Kahn says Pope Francis called on followers to fortify the family.
Pope Francis is urging Cubans to cherish families.
Cuidemos a nuestra familia verdaderos espacios de libertad.
Speaking to a huge crowd that spilled out of the church and into the streets at the cathedral in Santiago in eastern Cuba, the Pope said we must take care of our families, the true spaces of liberty. Earlier, the Pope called on Cubans to live a revolution of tenderness through joy that leads one to get involved and serve the life of others. As he's done throughout his stay in the communist nation, the Pope refrained from overt political proclamations. He did not call on the U.S. to end the economic embargo against Cuba, as many here had hoped, nor did he address the condition of human rights on the island or meet with dissidents. Carrie Kahn, NPR News, Havana.
The White House is preparing to host the president of China later this week at a time when relations between both nations are tense over cybersecurity, Chinese activity in the South China Sea, and currency manipulation. President Xi Jinping's visit also comes nearly a year after his nation and the U.S., two of the world's biggest polluters, pledged to ramp up their joint effort to address climate change. The Dow is down 244 points, more than 1%. This is NPR News. The Senate's investigating reports of retaliation against whistleblowers at the Department of Veterans Affairs. NPR's Quill Lawrence's employees who exposed wrongdoing claim they're the ones getting punished.
Brandon Coleman is a former Marine who worked at the Phoenix VA. He says he watched suicidal vets leave the hospital without getting care. He told the Senate committee that when he spoke up, he got suspended.
And when I came forward to my frontline supervisor, the first thing out of her mouth when I said I was coming forward regarding suicidal vets, she goes, "That's how people get fired."
The testimony follows a government report that found the VA has been slow to fire staff for corruption or incompetence, but has been quick to punish whistleblowers who expose these problems. Senators from both parties are calling for President Obama to nominate a permanent inspector general at VA. The job has been filled on a temporary basis for nearly 2 years. Quill Lawrence, NPR News.
The Department of the Interior is now saying that the greater sage grouse, a peculiar western bird, does not need protections under the Endangered Species Act. Here's NPR's Nathan Roth.
The greater sage grouse lives in 11 western states in an area the size of Texas. Its habitat is also home to developers, oil and gas, mining and agriculture, which have been worried that a listing of the bird as endangered would cost them billions of dollars in lost economic activity. The Fish and Wildlife Service is basing their decision to not list the greater sage grouse on the grounds that its population is larger than expected and more stable than ever before. That's thanks to years of state, federal, and private conservation efforts. The decision is expected to be challenged by both environmental groups and industry. Nathan Roth, NPR News.
I'm Lakshmi Singh, NPR News in Washington.
Support for NPR comes from NPR stations. Other contributors include Progressive Insurance, with insurance for cars, home, boat, motorcycles, RVs, and commercial vehicles at 1-800-PROGRESSIVE and Progressive.com. And from the listeners who support this NPR station.
Walking around PS18, it looks like the only way to enroll another 100 students would be to convert these spaces to classrooms. In overcrowded schools, that's what principals do.
You use the auditorium, you use any and all space that you can, even hallways.
Hear the news from the people who are living it and analysis from reporters you trust. Listen to Morning Edition every day on WNYC.
This is Fresh Air. I'm Terry Gross. The survival rate for women with breast cancer is higher than ever, approaching 90%. We're going to talk about recent improvements in diagnosing and treating breast cancer and in breast reconstruction with Dr. Elisa Port, author of the new book, The New Generation Breast Cancer Book. She's chief of breast surgery at Mount Sinai Medical Center in New York and director of its Dubin Breast Center. Dr. Elisa Port, welcome to Fresh Air.
What's the most cutting-edge development you're currently using?
There's a variety of different things going on. The cure rates from breast cancer have never been better. And while, of course, it is still a potentially lethal disease, we're doing better than ever before with all different subtypes of breast cancer. And that's mostly related to research advances. And so, obviously, drug development targeted at very, very specific tumor types. We can look at a woman and her individual tumor and try to customize and personalize treatments for her particular case. I can give you an example of that. There's a test that's commercially available called the Oncotype test, and that's a test that we frequently do for subsets of women with breast cancer to help us decide. It's basically a tumor profile test. We take a snippet of their tumor, and a genetic profile is run on that tumor to tell us a little bit more about how it's behaving biologically. And for example, it can give us very personalized information for a woman that looked like she had a relatively indolent cancer, telling us, no, it's really behaving more aggressively than we would expect. And perhaps we want to treat that person more aggressively in turn with chemotherapy, that sort of thing. Alternatively, it could give us the opposite information. So some of these tests are really almost standard of care and more widely available. Some of them are being done at only the top tier centers.
When you are profiling a tumor, do you then test it with different forms of chemo to see which chemo can effectively attack the tumor?
This is definitely the wave of the future. We actually do that. We take snippets of tissue from women who have a more biologically aggressive form of breast cancer. It's known as triple negative breast cancer. And we're taking actually a snippet of that tumor and trying to grow it out in animal models and in cell models where we can potentially try out different types of chemotherapy to see what the response rate is before actually giving that to the person.
Mammograms have become a little more confusing because there are choices now. There's more than just the conventional mammogram x-ray. There's now 3D mammograms. There's the options of MRIs and possibly even sonograms. Can you just give us an overview of when you might want to do something other than the conventional mammogram?
Sure. I think this is a real hot button issue because there's so many mixed messages that are being sent to women across this country. Mammograms are definitely the most effective way to pick up breast cancer for the general population. And that's why the current recommendations are that every woman gets screened with a mammogram starting at age 40. Period. End of discussion. That said, every person is different and their risk factors are different, and there absolutely may be a role for adding on to the mammogram, not instead of, for women depending on their risk level, their breast density, and again, their underlying health.
Why don't you describe what the 3D mammogram is?
Sure.
It's a relatively new option for women.
Yeah.
And it's not being prescribed for everyone. It's select women.
So 3D mammography is kind of a software update to conventional imaging where basically for a slightly higher dose of radiation, it takes multiple pictures through the breast, and you have to envision it. The way I explain it to women is it's almost like it's different paging through a book. So rather than generating one image in one direction and a second image in the other direction, you get multiple images, slices through the breast. And the thing that it's most helpful with is reducing the risk of what we call false positives. So saying there's something there when there really isn't, based on tissue overlap. So if you see a dense piece of tissue in one part of the breast and a dense piece of tissue in another part of the breast, and those lie over each other in one view, it may look doubly dense. When you take these sheets of tissue,
it may look like a tumor is what you're saying.
Yes, it absolutely can mimic looking like a tumor. And then what 3D mammogram can help with is separating out these pieces of tissue, so as you look at them individually, you realize it was just a summation effect of all these things overlapped, and really there's nothing there. In some cases, it can pick up cancers that mammograms miss, and overall, it's probably better than a regular mammogram, or what's called a digital mammogram.
Now, what about an MRI? When do you think an MRI of the breast is called for?
MRI is a test that is very sensitive for picking up breast cancer. It's a test that's done with an IV injection where you receive a dye called gadolinium that circulates through the body, and it's picked up by areas of high blood flow. And one of the things that cause high blood flow is cancer. Cancer cells are growing and dividing very rapidly, and those involve increased blood flow in general. So MRIs are exquisitely sensitive to pick up cancer. So the question arises, why not MRIs for everyone? And the answer is because they are associated with a substantial risk of false positives. You do an MRI, 14 things light up in the breast, and that generates a lot of anxiety, a lot of unnecessary biopsies, and so forth. And so MRIs are generally reserved for screening women at the highest risk for breast cancer. We have to be really judicious with the ordering of MRIs, and those of us who do this for a living just have seen this play out time and time again. You don't want to order an MRI as a knee-jerk kind of response, and you want to think through what the possible outcomes are in each individual patient.
Because you don't want it to lead to a lot of unnecessary testing.
Correct. Right.
And scaring of women.
Of course, and unnecessarily when there's very little added benefit.
Yeah.
So obviously in the women who are at the highest risk for breast cancer, we worry more in those women about missing a cancer, and so the bar is much lower for doing these imaging studies, etc. And so we do, again, it goes back to our theme, and it's one of the themes in the book, of it's not a one-size-fits-all world anymore. And we, those of us who do this for a living know or try as best we can to customize approaches for each individual person.
One of your specialties as a surgeon is the sentinel lymph node biopsy. And
Sure.
You've written about it too in papers. So why don't you explain what the lymph node biopsy is in relation to breast cancer?
Sure. Finding out if breast cancer has spread to the lymph nodes is one of the single most important pieces of information. So in the old days, the only way of finding out if the lymph nodes were involved was to make a big cut under the arm and remove the nodes under the arm. So as tumors got smaller and smaller, that led to some very smart people saying, gosh, I wonder if there's a way to check the nodes under the arm without actually removing them all. Maybe we can just remove a couple of the lymph nodes, and that would be a good indicator as to whether or not the rest are involved. And then if those nodes are okay, we can leave the rest alone. So what sentinel node involves is that prior to surgery, a woman undergoes an injection of dye into her breast. And that dye travels along what's called the lymphatic pathways to a couple of nodes under the arm. And what that dye travel shows us is if this cancer is going to spread, here's where it's going to go first. These node or nodes, and it's usually 1 or 2 or 3, are the gatekeepers for the rest of the lymph nodes under that arm. And if you make a little cut, not a big one anymore, and pluck out those select nodes, and those are okay, the rest are okay too, and you basically reduced the degree of surgery that you have to do.
If you're just joining us, my guest is Dr. Elisa Port. She's the author of the new book, The New Generation Breast Cancer Book. She's the chief of breast surgery at Mount Sinai Medical Center in New York and co-director of its Dubin Breast Center. Let's take a short break, then we'll talk some more. This is Fresh Air.
5 years ago, Facebook founder Mark Zuckerberg donated $100 million to turn around Newark schools. Now we're asking, how was the money spent, and did it help? I'm Jamie Floyd, host of All Things Considered on WNYC. Join me, Newark Mayor Ras Baraka, and School Superintendent Chris Serb for a free community discussion Monday night at NJ PAC. Reservations at wnyc.org/events.
This is Fresh Air, and if you're just joining us, my guest is Dr. Elisa Fort. She's the author of the new book, The New Generation Breast Cancer Book. She's chief of breast surgery at Mount Sinai Medical Center and also the co-director of the center's Dubin Breast Center. Let's talk about mastectomies. A lot has changed with mastectomies. I would ask you about who should get a lumpectomy versus a mastectomy, but I think that's so specific probably to each individual patient. I'm not sure how useful a more general discussion of that would be, or you tell me.
Well, I think there are long and short answers for this question, and I think that the most important thing that women know is that there are both medical reasons why a woman needs one or the other, and personal reasons why a woman could choose one or the other. And that is the epicenter of my job on a daily basis, is working with a woman and giving her sort of the medical input and then saying these are your safe options. And women don't always have all of the options open to them.
So are there specific guidelines for when a mastectomy is absolutely required?
Sure. To give you a couple of general examples, a woman who has a large amount of cancer in her breast, where from a technical standpoint it would be very difficult to do a smaller operation, make a small incision, get an area out, get what we call clear margins, the whole area out, and leave her with a result that she's happy with. That's one very, very common reason why we would recommend a mastectomy. Another, and this is a little bit more of a moving target, is in general, a woman who has, even if the areas are small, in general, when more than one area of cancer is found in the breast, a mastectomy is usually recommended. Although in selected cases, people are starting to do what we call double lumpectomies, although generally it's not the standard of care.
When you're performing a mastectomy and your patient wants reconstruction, you're working with a plastic surgeon. What do you have to do as the breast surgeon to make sure that the cancer is gone, the breast is removed, but the breast is ready for reconstruction?
Yeah. That's the years of training, which is walking the fine line between, of course, the number one priority, which is making sure all the cancer's out. No one wants to go through that extent of operation and recovery and so forth, and then risk leaving cancer behind or an appreciable amount of breast tissue behind that could then form a new cancer. So, of course, the number one goal is cancer, but of course we want to balance this with the aesthetic concerns. And this is often, a battle in terms of making sure that we do the first, but also maximizing the chances of a good cosmetic result. For sure, my job is to remove as much breast tissue that I can. Often we try to make our incisions really strategically located and as small as we can. And obviously it's our job as breast surgeons to make sure that we're not compromising the results of cancer removal. When you make a really small incision, it can make it more difficult to remove the breast tissue that's far away from that incision. You just can't reach. And so we have to be really clear about what our goals are and really stick to our guns sometimes about making sure that we're not compromising the cancer part or the cancer priority.
So when your patient is having reconstructive surgery and they're doing it with an implant, you keep the original breast skin to cover the implant?
Yes, absolutely. So in general, most mastectomies that are done, especially those with reconstruction, are what are called skin-sparing mastectomies, where we can make really relatively small incisions. If we are removing the nipple, we go above the nipple and below the nipple with our small incisions and remove the small ellipse of tissue, remove all of the breast through there. We can even check the nodes through that incision.
and leave the vast majority and preserve the vast majority of the skin envelope, where then at the same surgery, a plastic surgeon comes in with an implant or a smaller version, a temporary implant, what we call a tissue expander, and can inflate that to a degree that fills out that remaining skin envelope.
And that requires coming back several times for further surgeries?
Yes, so in general, it can be challenging for the plastic surgeons, although many are able to do it, and it's obviously, again, on a case-by-case basis. It can be challenging to put the full-size implant in at the same time as the mastectomy surgery. And that's for a couple of reasons. The skin, that after you do a mastectomy, the skin needs to heal. And it's somewhat traumatized from obviously removing the breast tissue beneath it, because that is the source of a large amount of its blood supply. And one of the things that can put further tension and pressure on that skin and affect wound healing is if you put a full-size implant under there that puts a lot of tension on the skin. So in many, many cases, putting the smaller tissue expander is advantageous because it really gives the skin a chance to recover without being under tension. And then over time, 2-3 weeks after surgery, an injection of saline into that temporary expander fills it out a little bit, and gradually the skin is stretched so that it can adapt every step of the way.
When you have successful reconstructive surgery through the more standard procedure, which is with the implants, how sensitive is the breast tissue to the touch following healing?
Right, you mean the overlying skin, because theoretically there should be.
Right.
Yeah, it's a really important point, and it is whether, I think one of the main points, we're doing more and more nipple preservation mastectomies now. But I think the key point that I have to make sure I inform women of is that whether you save the nipple, you don't save the nipple, most of the sensation is gone. And that's because the nerve endings that come through with the breast tissue are by and large removed.